I don't know why I'm telling this. I've spent every moment since that night trying to forget it, but it keeps creeping back into my mind, a dark stain I can't seem to scrub clean. Maybe if I write it down just once, I'll be able to let it go. Maybe somehow it'll make me feel less guilty for being the one who survived. It was supposed to be a road trip, just me and Eric driving down the coast for a few days to blow off some steam. We'd been planning it for a while, talking up the thrill of taking the old back roads, camping under the stars, and not worrying about a thing. We hadn't even mapped out the full route. The whole idea was to be spontaneous, to let each turn be decided by the music and the mood. The first couple of days were everything we'd hoped for. We camped on a cliff above the beach, woke up with the sun pouring over the ocean, and drove down winding roads with no one else in sight. We laughed until our voices were hoarse, sang along to old songs at the top of our lungs, and talked about everything and nothing. On the third day, we hit a road that twisted through miles of empty desert. The heat pressed down on us, turning the inside of the car into an oven, even with the windows down. We took turns driving, though I was the one who preferred to be behind the wheel. Eric, on the other hand, enjoyed just lounging in the passenger seat, feet up, taking pictures of the endless stretches of sand. It was late afternoon when we saw him, a lone figure standing on the side of the road. He had his thumb out, the universal symbol of a hitchhiker, and he was looking at us like he knew we'd stop. At first, I didn't even think about it. We were in the middle of nowhere. There was no reason not to give the guy a lift, right? Eric leaned out the window and waved at him as we pulled over. The man stepped forward, his face cast in shadow by the angle of the sun. He was tall, a bit older than us, with a graying beard and clothes that looked like they'd been through their fair share of miles. He didn't say much, just nodded and climbed into the back seat without much of a word. There was something strange about him, though. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, I caught his eyes, a murky gray that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. But Eric didn't seem bothered, so I tried to shrug it off. "Where are you headed?" Eric asked, turning around to get a better look at him. "South," the man answered in a low, gruff voice. He looked down at his hands as he spoke, not meeting our eyes. "South works for us," I said, trying to lighten the mood, but there was no response from him. I kept my eyes on the road, but the atmosphere in the car shifted. The light-hearted feeling we'd had all day seemed to evaporate. Eric was the type who'd talk to anyone. He tried to start up a conversation a few times, but our hitchhiker only answered in clipped responses, never offering anything more. After a while, even Eric gave up, leaning back in his seat and muttering under his breath. For an hour we drove in silence, the only sounds the faint hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the man shifting in the back seat. I could feel the tension in my hands gripping the wheel, my knuckles white against the heat of the dashboard. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Eric pulled out a map and suggested we find somewhere to stop for the night. "There should be a small town coming up," he said, tracing a line with his finger. But before we could decide, the man spoke up. "There's a place just off the road, about 10 miles ahead, an old motel." The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, though I couldn't say why. Maybe it was his voice, low and flat, with a tone that suggested he'd been there before. Eric shrugged, indifferent to the oddness, and I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I nodded. "Sounds good," I said, forcing a smile. "Let's check it out." The motel was barely a dot on the map, a forgotten relic with faded paint and a flickering neon sign that barely lit up the dusty parking lot. It looked abandoned at first glance, but as we got closer, a faint light glowed in the office window. The man stepped out of the car and walked straight for the office without a word. I watched him disappear inside, a strange sense of relief washing over me. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "I don't like this place," I muttered to Eric, but he only chuckled, brushing it off. "Come on, it's an adventure, right?" he said, giving me a playful nudge. But I could see a flicker of unease in his eyes, too. Our hitchhiker came back with a key and gestured to one of the rooms. He didn't ask if we wanted to share a room, and for some reason, we just went along with it, following him to the door. The room was dark and smelled like mildew. One dim bulb hung from the ceiling, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward us. "Cozy," Eric joked, but his voice lacked its usual humor. We set our bags down and tried to make ourselves comfortable, but as the night wore on, the silence grew heavier, pressing in on us from every corner. I lay on one of the beds, staring at the cracked ceiling, unable to sleep. I could hear Eric's soft breathing on the other side of the room and the occasional creak of the floorboards. Around midnight, the man stood up without a word and walked out of the room. I watched him go, feeling a mix of relief and dread. The door clicked shut behind him, and I heard his footsteps fade into the night. I must have drifted off eventually because when I opened my eyes, it was morning. The first thing I noticed was the empty bed next to mine. Eric was gone. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, and called his name. No answer. His bag was still by the door, untouched. I felt a growing sense of panic, a knot tightening in my chest. I threw on my shoes and stumbled outside, hoping to see him in the parking lot or around the motel. The hitchhiker was sitting on the curb, smoking a cigarette, his face shadowed in the morning light. "Where's Eric?" I demanded, my voice sharper than I intended. He shrugged, exhaling a plume of smoke. "He went for a walk," he said. But there was something in his tone that made my skin crawl. "What do you mean? Where did he go?" I was struggling to keep my voice steady, but the man only smiled, a slow, cold twist of his lips. "He'll be back," he said, his voice low and certain. But somehow, I knew he wouldn't. I spent hours searching, my calls echoing through the empty desert. There was no sign of Eric, and each time I returned to the motel, the hitchhiker would be there, waiting, watching me with that cold, impassive gaze. Finally, as the sun dipped below the horizon again, I went back to the room, defeated. I collapsed onto the bed, exhausted, my mind racing with fear and confusion. It was then that I noticed a scrap of paper on the nightstand. I picked it up, my heart pounding, and saw it was a note, scrawled in Eric's handwriting. "Don't trust him. Leave now." I dropped the note, my hands shaking. I stumbled out of the room, the desert stretching out before me, empty and silent. The hitchhiker was nowhere to be seen. I didn't look back as I drove away, the dust swirling in my rearview mirror, the empty motel fading into the night behind me. Eric never came back. The emptiness of the desert stretched before me as I drove, my mind reeling. The note was still in my pocket, Eric's scrawled warning like a pulse against my leg. "Don't trust him. Leave now." Those words haunted me, tangling with the memories of the past 2 days until I couldn't tell what was real and what wasn't. I drove until the sun began to rise, a thin strip of light cutting across the horizon, and finally pulled into a gas station on the edge of a small, dusty town. I parked and stumbled out of the car, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The clerk behind the counter, a grizzled man with deep-set eyes, gave me a wary look as I grabbed a bottle of water and some snacks. "Long night?" he asked, his voice rough. "Yeah," I muttered, not looking up. "You could say that." I sat on the curb outside, the water bottle clutched in my hand, and tried to steady my breathing. Eric's face kept flashing in my mind, his easy grin, the way he'd shrugged off my worries. He was just gone. And the hitchhiker's cold, empty stare haunted me. A hollow reminder of that motel and everything I'd left behind. After a while, I mustered the courage to pull out my phone and call the police. My fingers shook as I dialed, feeling ridiculous trying to explain it to myself, let alone someone else. How could I tell them that my friend had simply vanished in the middle of the desert after we'd picked up a stranger? When the officer finally arrived, I recounted the story as best as I could. She listened intently, her gaze sharp, but as I finished, I could see the flicker of doubt in her eyes. "You said you didn't actually see him leave?" she asked, jotting down notes. Her tone was careful, as if she was testing my sanity. I shook my head, realizing how absurd it sounded. "No, I was asleep. When I woke up, he was just gone." The officer nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "We'll do what we can. she said. But out here, people disappear. It's easy to get lost in the desert. The words hit me hard as if I was just another traveler who'd gotten too close to the edge. But Eric wouldn't have just wandered off. He'd left that note for a reason. He'd known something was wrong. And if he was out there somewhere, lost or worse, I couldn't bear the thought of leaving him behind. They told me to check back in a few days, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just been dismissed. I couldn't bring myself to leave, though, so I stayed in that small town, roaming the roads every day, scanning the desert, calling his name into the empty expanse. Each night, I'd end up in my motel room, staring at the ceiling, replaying that last conversation with the hitchhiker, wondering what I'd missed, what I could have done differently. Days turned into a week, and I grew more desperate, haunted by half-glimpsed memories and the nagging feeling that I'd forgotten something important. I started asking around, trying to find anyone who knew the man we'd picked up, anyone who might have seen him. One afternoon, I showed Eric's photo to an old woman who ran a small diner on the edge of town. She looked at it, her eyes narrowing. "He was with you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I nodded. "Yeah, he went missing." Her gaze shifted, and I saw something in her expression I hadn't seen in anyone else. Recognition. She glanced around, as if someone might overhear, and then beckoned me to follow her to a quiet corner of the diner. "You're not the first one to come looking for a friend," she said, her voice low and serious. "I've seen them come through looking lost, same as you, asking about a friend who disappeared on these roads." I felt a cold crawl down my back. "What do you mean?" "They pick him up," she continued, her voice almost a whisper. "They don't know him, and they all leave alone." Her gaze turned sharp, piercing. "Did he say much to you?" I shook my head, my mind racing. "Hardly anything. He barely talked at all." She nodded, as if that confirmed something she'd already known. "That's because he doesn't need to. Once he's in your car, he's already taken what he needs." My hands were trembling. "What are you talking about?" She leaned closer. "That hitchhiker, he isn't just some lost soul. He's been out here longer than anyone can remember, showing up now and then, always looking the same, always hitching rides. People who pick him up end up with memories that don't add up, friends who vanish without a trace." Her words sank into me, filling me with a cold, gnawing dread. "But that doesn't make any sense. He was just a man." She shook her head. "I've heard it all before. He's just a man to you, but to the ones who disappear, he's something else. He's a shadow that feeds on lost souls." I stumbled back, unable to process her words. It sounded impossible, like something out of a nightmare. But as I thought back, the gaps in my memory, the strange feeling of fog around that night, all of it suddenly made a horrible kind of sense. Whatever he was, he had taken Eric, and I'd been left behind, marked by his silent presence. I left the diner in a daze, the desert stretching endlessly around me. Every shadow along the road seemed to twist and shift, like it held secrets I couldn't bear to uncover. I stayed in that town for another week, driving those empty desert roads, searching, clinging to the idea that maybe, somehow, I could find Eric. But with each day, the gaps in my memory widened, leaving me haunted by half-formed images, sounds I could barely remember, and a chilling certainty that I'd missed something vital. The police stopped taking my calls, dismissing me as a grieving friend who'd lost his grip on reality. On my last night in town, I returned to the motel room, pacing until my thoughts tangled. I grabbed Eric's note from my pocket, running my fingers over the faded ink. "Don't trust him. Leave now." I must have read those words 100 times, but I still felt I was missing something, a hidden meaning, something I'd overlooked. Then, almost on instinct, I checked my phone, scrolling through my texts, photos, anything to make sense of what had happened. But when I reached the photo gallery, my breath caught. There, amidst random shots from our trip, was a photo I didn't remember taking. A blurred, distorted image of Eric, his face half lit by the car's headlights. But something else was in the frame too, something that made my skin crawl. Just behind Eric, leaning against the car window, was the hitchhiker's face, grinning, eyes hollow and lifeless. I stared at the photo, heart racing. I hadn't taken it. I didn't even remember seeing him get that close to Eric. My fingers trembled as I swiped again, finding another photo. This one darker, taken from the back seat, as if someone had snapped it from right behind us. The image showed the hitchhiker in sharp focus, while Eric and I sat oblivious in the front seats, laughing. My stomach twisted as I noticed his hand, long and thin, resting just behind my shoulder. I fumbled, nearly dropping the phone, my mind spiraling. The photos made no sense. There were 5 more, each one closer, each one more disturbing than the last. In one, Eric was asleep, his head against the window while the hitchhiker stared at him from the shadows, a hand hovering over his face. The final photo was of me, just me, standing by the car, looking directly into the lens. My expression was vacant, hollow, as if I were sleepwalking. Behind me, the hitchhiker loomed, his grin wider than I remembered, his eyes darker than night. It looked as though he were whispering something in my ear, and I could swear, even in the grainy darkness, that he was mouthing 2 words. "It's time." I slammed the phone down, breath coming in shallow gasps, and bolted from the room, my footsteps echoing in the motel hallway. I ran out to the car, feeling the unbearable weight of the desert pressing down on me, of all those empty roads and endless miles. I drove for hours, unable to shake the feeling that the hitchhiker was there, just out of sight, watching, waiting. Days later, when I finally returned home, I couldn't bear to look at the photos again. I deleted them all, hoping to erase whatever had attached itself to me, hoping it would end there. But every so often, late at night, I still feel it. The memory of that cold, empty stare, the ghostly weight of a hand on my shoulder. And sometimes when I wake in the early hours, my phone screen is lit, the gallery open to an empty, dark photo. The hitchhiker is gone. But sometimes in the silence, I wonder if he left me behind, or if he's still with me, waiting for the right moment to take me, just like he took Eric.